You're listening to One Concerned American. This video is the second in a series that discusses how secret societies and conspiracies have prevailed in the United States since our founding. If you haven't seen the first video, please make sure you go back and watch that one first, and make sure you give us a subscription so that you can stay tuned and support all of our research here. Now, this part is going to focus on the early national period up through the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. When we first gained our independence from Great Britain, each colony became a free, sovereign, and independent state according to King George III. The Articles of Confederation started as a wartime government, and it lasted until 1787, and there were some good things about this government. For example, the president's only job was to actually preside over Congress. And there were many presidents before George Washington. He was just the first under the Constitution. Under the Articles, amending the document required approval from all 13 states. And remember, that's because these guys were just fighting a tyrannical government, and they wanted to make sure that nobody could get power too easily. They wanted to make sure that the government they had would stay in place. The Articles were actually meant to be perpetual. It says it on the title of the document. It's the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. Perpetual means forever. The government could request that states pay their taxes under the Articles, but they could not force them. So this wasn't a perfect government, but it did exactly what it was intended to do at that time. And since then, many institutions and organizations have actually tried to rewrite this history completely and depict the Articles as a terrible government that was remade into a constitutional republic by the whole mass of people in America. For example, George Bancroft wrote in his History of the United States, Volume 6, that the people of the states demanded a federal convention to form the Constitution. The federal Congress offered that Constitution severally to the people of each state, and by their united voice, it was made the binding form of government. Well, the problem with this statement is that the Constitutional Convention was actually very secretive, and the Constitution in itself was created in a conspiracy because it actually violated our first government under the Articles. Remember, all 13 states had to agree before that document could be amended, yet 9 of them broke that agreement and created the Constitution. That's why when you read Article 7, it says only 9 states are required to ratify the Constitution. Again, a group of men came together and decided they wanted to make a new government. That's exactly what a conspiracy is. In addition, there were also multiple foreign influences and rebellions in the first 20 years of our national history that nearly destroyed us and planted the seeds for some of the exact movements that we're seeing today. So you need to remember, when we signed the Constitution, not every state agreed to it at first, and some states like North Carolina and Rhode Island, they didn't sign until later. So the Union was very weak to begin with, and all the states were very reluctant to give up much of their power because they each started as a sovereign state, very much like a country. We also need to remember that one of the major French influences were people like Jacques-Pierre Brissot, who was definitely Illuminati affiliated. He formed the Gallo-American Society, which opened chapters here in the US. He founded the French Society of the Friends of the Blacks, which was a good idea in itself, but it only promoted agitation by sending abolitionist pamphlets throughout the United States, forming democratic clubs in the various cities, and encouraging dissent. When if you look at the French, they had colonies in places like Haiti, Africa. They had land in Vietnam where they horribly mistreated the natives, yet they wanted to sow discontent here in America over our slavery. So that tells you that they were basically trying to bring radical Jacobinism here to the United States. We also had influences from people like Edmond Genet. He was a French ambassador who wanted to get the United States allied with revolutionary France. He founded the Philadelphia Society, which was the mother lodge of democratic societies here in the United States. He actually encouraged American vessels of war to attack English and Spanish shipping, So he was basically trying to encourage something like the War of 1812 before we even got into it. He established French courts, tried to raise armies in America to invade Florida and the Mississippi Valley. He hired George Rogers Clark to command an army for France on American soil. Another influence was actually Nicholas Bonneville, who we talked about in the last video. He wrote a book called The Illuminati Manifesto for World Revolution. And in 1790, he founded a group called the Social Circle, which was also known as the Society of the Friends of Truth. This was an occult and anti-Christian group, and they wanted to initiate a world revolution and bring mandatory atheism. They basically believed that men were like gods or could be like gods. And the whole idea of the Social Circle was to serve as like the inner party from 1984, as a group behind the curtain who's really pulling all the strings and making everything happen that we're seeing with government. And they were very occult and anti-Christian. Again, if you look at the image here, you can see that they wore garbs that reflect a lot of Masonic symbolism. The Freemason French influence also touched our cabinet under George Washington as well. Philip Freneau was a clerk in the State Department and an editor at the Philadelphia paper, the National Gazette. And at one point, Freneau was giving information to Edmund Genet. Washington found out about this and wanted him fired, but Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State at that time, refused. And remember, Washington's cabinet was actually very divided when England and France went to war over who we should side with. Some of the major Federalists like Hamilton wanted to side with England because they had been our mother country. Some of the more anti-Federalists like Thomas Jefferson and his supporters thought we should side with the French because they had helped us in the American Revolution. So Jefferson was definitely sympathetic with the French, and we know that people who worked with him were giving information to the French, so they were basically like moles within our government. Next, we also had Albert Gallatin, who was from Geneva, and he was one of the key instigators behind the Whiskey Rebellion. I'll show you some evidence to prove that here shortly. But he was named by the state legislature in 1794 as a U.S. Senator. He served as the Secretary of the Treasury under Thomas Jefferson, which is interesting because Thomas Jefferson actually stated that he was against the National Bank, yet he appointed Albert Gallatin, who was actually for it. He was an international monetary expert. It just shows you that Jefferson didn't actually reveal his true self when he was writing his words about the National Bank, so that's very interesting. So again, this radical foreign influence brought a lot of successful democratic clubs to America, and you can see that some of their symbolism was very occult. I mean, you've got the triangle within the circle. That's a symbol that we see today in places like Alcoholics Anonymous. I think it's also a symbol within the homosexual community, and this pyramid has an all-seeing eye within it. And then the circle is actually an Ouroboros, which is a snake eating its own tail, and it represents life and death and rebirth, basically infinity. And this was a major symbol in the French Revolution, so this was the type of stuff that they were trying to bring here to America. I mean, you see the symbol for fascism over on the right, you see the red caps, and these things were actually being circulated here in America at some points by people who wanted to bring that. And one of the first real tests of how strong our union was going to be came with the short-lived state of Franklin. Now, this is part of modern-day Tennessee, and this little breakoff was actually likely influenced by these French democratic societies. It was a planned breakoff on the border of North Carolina, and the main governor involved, John Sevier, was actually a Democratic Republican. And what happened here was North Carolina actually ceded part of their land to the United States, and then the counties declared their independence and petitioned for statehood because North Carolina tried to get them back, and they decided they wanted to be their own independent state. They couldn't get a 2/3 majority of Congress to vote in their favor, and they existed as an independent nation from 1784 to 1790. And it's very interesting because the state of Franklin actually used a system of barter for a while, and really one of the only reasons that it didn't last was that they were getting attacked by Indians and they really wanted help from the federal government. And then when we got to Shays' Rebellion in the year 1786 through 1787, this basically happened because farmers in Massachusetts that had fought in the Revolution were being jailed or having their property confiscated for not paying their debts. Veterans also had difficulty collecting their pay because of the economic conditions, and it boiled over into a rebellion. A few people were killed, some were arrested or hanged, and this is usually explained as the event that led to a stronger government under the Constitution. Some histories outright say that all the people came together after Shays' Rebellion and just decided they wanted a stronger government. If you read Alexander Stevens' A Pictorial History of the United States from 1882, he said, quote, "In Massachusetts a strong party arose, who had borne the brunt of the fight, against those who by trade and traffic at home had become rich during the war. This ended in what is known as Shays' Rebellion in that state, about which so much error has been put forth by writers and incorporated into histories. It was bad enough as it was, but not as bad as it has been represented. It was an organized resistance to the collection of personal debts which were deemed unjust. It aimed at no resistance to the federal authority." So people actually try to say that because of Shays' Rebellion, all the 13 states under the Articles just decided they wanted the Constitution. But go and study it, they all couldn't agree. And again, that's why we have Article 7 that says it only takes 9 states to form the Constitution. And go back and look at what Patrick Henry said. He thought when the Philadelphia Convention came around, he thought that he smelled a rat, and he thought the states would wind up giving up too much power. And that's why we're constantly seeing every day the states are fighting with the federal government over their authority. So Shays' Rebellion didn't happen because the Articles of Confederation was a bad government. It happened because Massachusetts simply didn't have their affairs in order. A similar event happened that was called the Paper Money Riot in New Hampshire the exact same year. In fact, the Articles were based on the good faith of each state, and they did exactly what they were intended to do. And the worst part is that the Constitution did nothing at first to really fix the problems. It just created a stronger federal government. For example, when the Whiskey Rebellion was occurring in Pennsylvania, the frontiersmen and farmers were tarring and feathering all the tax collectors, refusing to pay excise taxes on whiskey. But now the federal government had the power to stop them. Additionally, we have primary documents showing that there were French influences behind the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington wrote when he was president that the self-created societies who have spread themselves over this country have been laboring incessantly to sow the seeds of distrust, jealousy, and of course discontent, hoping thereby to effect some revolution in the government, is not unknown to you. That they have been the fomenters of the Western disturbances admit of no doubt in the mind of anyone who will examine their conduct. He also wrote in a letter to Henry Lee that these democratic societies were leading the most diabolical attempt to destroy the best fabric of human government and happiness that has ever been presented for the acceptance of mankind. And how might Washington have known about this? Well, his own Attorney General Edmund Randolph was a part of bringing this Whiskey Rebellion to fruition. In fact, the British Navy had recovered French dispatches that showed Randolph colluded with Jean-Antoine Joseph Fauché, who was a French ambassador, to instigate the Whiskey Rebellion. And if you study the story, it's interesting because they captured someone who actually jumped into the water and tried to throw these documents and get rid of them, and a British sailor actually jumped into the water and recovered the documents. And at the time, it was normal for these Europeans to try to forge documents like this, but when Randolph was presented this evidence, he actually resigned, which shows that maybe there was more to this. And when you look at what happened with the Articles of Confederation, Edmund Randolph was the man who offered the Virginia Plan at the Constitutional Convention, when the goal was really just to modify the Articles. So you could technically argue that he committed some type of treason because he only really had the authority to change the Articles, but instead he tried to create a whole new government with the Constitution, which not all of the states agreed to. Another example of a source that proves the French influence behind the Whiskey Rebellion is a letter from Adams to Jefferson on June 30th in 1813. And Adams wrote, "I believe you never felt the terrorism of Gallatin's insurrection in Pennsylvania. you certainly never felt the terrorism excited by Genet in 1793 when 10,000 people in the streets of Philadelphia day after day threatened to drag Washington out of his house and effect a revolution in the government or compel it to declare war in favor of the French Revolution and against England. Nothing but the yellow fever could have saved the United States from a total revolution of government. And this is actually really interesting because there's a book called Fever 1793 by Laurie Anderson, and a lot of kids read this in school, and it actually talks about this yellow fever outbreak that year. And if you look at the book, it's got the one-eye symbolism. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, people. Now, when it came to the presidency of John Adams, this was a guy that I spent most of my life not liking. I mean, most people know that he was the lawyer who defended the British soldiers that shot some people in the Boston Massacre. And most people know that he was a Federalist who worked to try to stay neutral in the wars going on between Britain and France. And I think if you really study Adams, he's kind of been mislabeled as an elitist. I mean, if you look at the XYZ affair, basically, he sent some ambassadors over to France, and these people wanted bribes just to sit down with their leaders. And Adams instructed them to say, nope, we would pay millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. And he also gets a pretty bad rap for the Alien and Sedition Acts. But if you look at these really, and you actually study the impact of these democratic societies and how we know that they influence things like the Whiskey Rebellion, they really weren't that extreme. I mean, especially when you see things that are going on today where people are banning, entire countries and things like that all the time at the drop of a hat. And if you read John Quincy Adams, he wrote a history of the United States from the earliest period to the administration of President Johnson. He said, quote, "If Jefferson and Madison deemed the Alien and Sedition Acts plain and palpable infractions of the Constitution, Washington and Patrick Henry held them to be good and wholesome laws." And interestingly, if you read John Quincy Adams, he actually wrote a series of letters defending the fact that John Adams had not been a Freemason and that he was not a member of any types of secret societies. And if you really study that time, the Freemasons had been getting a bad rap because a man named William Morgan had been killed for allegedly leaking some of the secrets of Freemasonry. So there was a lot going on at that time, and it seems like Adams was really one of the only people that was trying to stop what was going on as far as the conspiracy spreading anarchy to the United States. And if you study an event called Fry's Rebellion, this was actually an uprising of farmers who basically got pissed when Adams raised the taxes because we were in a quasi-war with Britain and France. And basically, this rebellion was stopped real quickly. There was a little bit of violence, but Adams ended up pardoning these guys. So most people think that Jefferson is the guy that liked a little rebellion and thought it was a good thing. But when it came down to it, Adams actually pardoned people who started rebellions. So you could study Fry's Rebellion and actually learn a good, interesting bit about Adams from that event. So if you study the actual political cartoons from the time, you can see that these guys were really starkly divided here. I mean, if you look, this is a Federalist cartoon depicting the anti-Federalists as basically in league with Satan. They're hanging out with black people who they're trying to say don't know about politics, and they're depicting them in kind of a racist way. And it also has them obese, basically saying there is no government but an aristocracy, and they want nothing but anarchy. So really, at this time, I mean, anti-federalists and the Democratic Republicans were really bringing a lot of radical French influence into this country. And we will show you in future videos that you can draw a direct line from this foreign influence to communism and some of the more radical left groups that we see today here in America. So after the Alien and Sedition Acts, while vice president under Adams, Thomas Jefferson conspired in 1798 at Monticello with Wilson C. and George Nicholas, and with John Breckinridge to promote ideas of secession and state sovereignty. George Nicholas was on a Spanish pension and was possibly working with them to take the Mississippi Valley. So Thomas Jefferson actually was behind writing the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and he was trying to assert state sovereignty, but this is also something that's used for the basis of secession later on. So there's a lot there that really makes Jefferson kind of seen in a suspicious light if you consider that treasonous. So at the same time, England also passed an act in 1799 called an Act Against Unlawful Combinations and Confederacies, which was basically saying that yes, there were a lot of secretive societies that were out to destroy society. And with the exception of Freemasonry, they wanted to try to ban these groups and keep them from meeting. I'll go ahead and let you pause this if you want to read the whole thing, but it is an interesting act that, again, does further document that yes, these radical democratic clubs did have influences and were influenced by other groups like the Illuminati. One of the people that was trying to expose this stuff was a man named Jedediah Morse. He wrote a book called Present Dangers, and in that book you can see he said, quote, "Nay, there is too much reason to fear that the many thousands of Frenchmen who are scattered throughout the United States, particularly southward of New England, are combined and organized with other foreigners, and some disaffected and directed by their masters in France, and that they are in concert systematically conducting the plan of revolutionizing this country." And interestingly, when we get to Thomas Jefferson as president, he actually defended the founders of the Illuminati. He said that Adam Weishaupt was a philanthropist and a fine Christian man who wanted the perfectibility of man. And he wrote about people like Morse who were exposing the conspiracy, and his other writers who helped him, people like Abe Barule. He actually called Barule a raving bedlamite, basically saying that these guys were insane. So while Jefferson apologized for the founder of the Illuminati, he actually called the people who were trying to expose the conspiracy insane. And remember, Jefferson was the man who founded the Republican Party, which became the Democratic Republicans, which we'll talk about a lot later, really have formed a lot of the ideas that are behind the Democratic Party today. I mean, a lot of people don't like to admit that, but that's something we'll get into a little bit further down the line. And just remember that when Jefferson was president, the New England states actually did consider seceding because of Jefferson's 1807 Embargo Act and because of the Louisiana Purchase. And we can see in their documents that they considered making a New England Confederacy at that time because their shipping and trade industry had been so disrupted. We also had a conspiracy under Thomas Jefferson's vice president, Aaron Burr. Now, Aaron Burr tied with Thomas Jefferson in the Electoral College election of 1801, but he lost the vote in Congress, and he presided over the U.S. Senate as vice president until shortly after he killed Hamilton in a duel in July of 1804. He became involved in a plot to divide the United States and take the western portion along the Mississippi Valley. Burr worked with the Spanish and French to gain financing so he could weaken the U.S. and rule his own country. Andrew Jackson and James Wilkinson, who was a general in the United States Army, were both involved in this. So, one great source to find more out about Aaron Burr's conspiracy is actually called A History of American Conspiracies, a record of treason, insurrection, rebellion, etc. in the United States of America from 1760 to 1860. They said that General Wilkinson worked for years to separate the West from the East. He and others took Spanish money and plotted to betray Kentucky into Spanish hands. Accomplices retained in federal office after their guilt was known. George Nichols acted as Jefferson's chief instrument in forcing the Kentucky legislature's solutions of 1798. Wilkinson played a role in the Burr conspiracy. Burr's only crime was trying to lead a design by Wilkinson-Jefferson to usurp their leadership. And finally, Jefferson not only wanted to take Florida and Mexico, but Cuba too. So that's from one source that went pretty in detail on the Burr conspiracy. There are other books on it. And this is a map from Mr. Z, who has another channel where he does videos on history. And I think this is a pretty interesting map and might not be 100% accurate, but you could certainly contact him to see if he could verify this. He made a video with an alternate history if, Aaron Burr had succeeded in this conspiracy. So one of the final sources I want to show you to kind of wrap this up is from a book called Horace Greeley and Other Pioneers of American Socialism by Charles Sutherland, which was written in 1892. He said, quote, "In those days to be called a Democrat was considered quite as insulting and infamous as being styled nowadays an anarchist, and it was not half so respectable in the public opinion as even now is thought to be that grossly misrepresented individual, a socialist." But fashions and opinions change. We also have a New York Senate report of 1920 titled Revolutionary Radicalism, where they wrote, quote, "As an illustration of the effect of European movements upon the United States, we may make reference to the influence which the Jacobin clubs of the French Revolution had upon the malcontents in the United States in the latter part of the 18th century. The Whiskey Rebellion of Western Pennsylvania was the outgrowth of agitation carried on by so-called democratic societies acting under the guise of protectors of civil liberties, which received their inspiration from the French revolutionary societies." So, in closing, we need to acknowledge that, yes, the Constitution was created through a conspiracy that destroyed the Articles, and it violated the agreement of the Articles. People within Washington's cabinet conspired with the French. People in Jefferson's cabinet conspired with the French and the Spanish. I mean, if you look at early American history, y'all think it's people sitting down drinking tea on the plantation, and actually it's something more like Game of Thrones. People were getting killed out here. Study Jefferson's assistant, Meriwether Lewis. He died very suspiciously, and people think he might have known something about Jefferson's connection to this Burr conspiracy. Jefferson actually wrote a letter out saying that Lewis was a notorious drunk, and, that it was likely he killed himself, and everything was very suspicious. So if you keep looking into this, you'll see that the seeds for the radicalism we see today in America were actually planted in the founding generation. And, I used to think John Adams was not a great president, but when I studied it more from an unbiased perspective, I think he was really one of the only ones that tried to keep America a strong and independent nation. So in the next video, we'll talk about things from the Andrew Jackson years up to the Civil War and some of the conspiracies that existed then. And we'll continue showing you how America was divided intentionally and foreign influences still have a large impact on our society today.